The day Harlan Mercer got called into Patricia Voss's office, he already knew it wasn't going to be a conversation. He'd seen the look before, not on her face specifically. He'd only worked under Patricia for 14 months, but on faces like hers. The kind of face that had already made the decision before you sat down, that was just waiting for the formality of your presence in the chair across the desk to make it official. Harlan had been in manufacturing long enough to recognize when a verdict had been handed down. Patricia's office on the 4th floor of Northgate Fabrications overlooked the plant floor below through a row of tall windows. You could watch the line from up there, watch the assemblers move between stations, watch the forklifts swing pallets, watch everything that the company measured and tracked and reported on quarterly. Patricia liked to stand at those windows when she spoke. She wasn't standing now. She was behind her desk with a folder open in front of her and her hands flat on either side of it. "Sit down, Harlan." He sat. "I've been looking at the allocation reports," she said, "specifically the materials draw on the secondary fabrication bay, Bay 4. Bay 4 was where Harlan worked on weekends. Had been for almost 2 years. The numbers don't line up with any active project code," Patricia continued. "I flagged it to accounting last month and they traced it back to an informal authorization you signed off on." She turned the folder toward him. "Your signature." Harlan looked at the paper. It was his signature. He'd signed that requisition for a roll of titanium-grade sheeting 16 months ago. He hadn't tried to hide it exactly. He'd used a blanket materials authorization that the plant had maintained for years under the previous director. A kind of standing approval for experimental work under a certain cost threshold. Nobody had told him the authorization had been quietly retired when Patricia took over. "Can you explain what that material was used for?" she asked. He could explain it. He'd spent the better part of 2 years being able to explain exactly what it was used for, in technical detail with documentation, but he understood what she was actually asking wasn't a question about materials. It was a question about whether he had a defense. "I've been working on a redesigned valve housing," he said, "for the thermal cycling problem in the northern pipeline contracts. The standard housing fails at sustained cold temperature pressure variance. I've been trying to solve that." Patricia looked at him for a moment. "Is that an active assigned project?" "No." "Did you submit a proposal to have it approved as a project?" "No." "Did you request budget allocation?" "No." She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're not surprised by an answer but needed to hear it confirmed out loud. "And in the time you've been using company materials and bay space on this unassigned, unapproved, unbudgeted work," she said, "what measurable output has there been?" Harlan thought about how to answer that. He thought about telling her that measurable output wasn't the right frame for what he was doing. He thought about telling her that the kind of problem he was solving didn't generate measurable output until it was solved, and that the moment it was solved the measurable output would be so significant it would justify everything 10 times over. He thought about all of that and then he looked at Patricia's face, and he understood that none of it would land the way he needed it to. "Nothing I can show you on paper yet," he said. She closed the folder. They let him clean out his workspace that afternoon. One of the facilities coordinators, a younger guy named Teague who'd always been decent to Harlan, walked with him to Bay 4 and waited while Harlan gathered his notebooks, his personal tools, his sketches. There was a prototype housing sitting on the workbench about 60% complete. Harlan looked at it for a long moment. "Is this company property?" he asked Teague. Teague looked uncomfortable. "Technically, anything produced using company materials on company time and premises. It's the weekend. I was here on weekends, I know. But the materials were company materials." Teague paused. "I'm sorry, Harlan. I really am." Harlan left the prototype on the bench. He picked up his notebooks. Those at least were unambiguously his, filled with his own handwriting in his own time on his own paper, and he put them in the cardboard box they'd given him and he walked out through the plant floor. Some of the assemblers looked up as he passed. Most of them looked back down at their work. A few nodded. Nobody said anything. That night he drove home to the house in Cochrane, the one he'd bought 12 years ago when he was still married, the one he'd stayed in afterward because his daughter Paige lived 20 minutes away and he wanted to be close to her and to his grandson Owen, who was 5 now and had a habit of calling Harlan Bumpa in a voice that could reorganize a man's entire sense of priorities. He put the cardboard box on the kitchen table and he made himself coffee and he sat there in the quiet of the house looking at the box. He was 53 years old. He had 30 years in industrial fabrication, the last 11 as a senior process engineer. He had a file of commendations from 3 different companies and a patent application from 2011 that had generated royalties he still received twice a year. He had the notebooks in the box in front of him, 19 of them now, filled with calculations and sketches and notes and dead ends and corrections, and a solution that he was more certain of with every passing month but had not yet been able to fully prove. He picked up his coffee and he thought about what Patricia had asked him, what measurable output. He thought about that for a long time. Then he finished his coffee and he went to bed, and in the morning he started making calls. The thermal cycling problem in northern pipeline infrastructure was not, as Patricia Voss had implied by her disinterest, a minor inconvenience. It was a slow catastrophe that the industry had been absorbing in small pieces for decades. At sustained low temperatures, the kind that settled into the northern Alberta corridor from October through March, standard carbon steel valve housings expanded and contracted with temperature variance in ways that caused microscopic fractures to propagate along weld seams. The fractures didn't cause immediate failure. They caused gradual degradation. Gradual degradation caused maintenance intervals to shorten. Shortened maintenance intervals cost money, took lines offline, reduced throughput, increased labor costs. Multiplied across thousands of installations over hundreds of kilometers of infrastructure, the numbers were enormous. The industry knew this. Everyone in pipeline fabrication knew this. The solution that everyone had reached through decades of incremental adjustment was to build the housings heavier and schedule more frequent inspections and absorb the cost. Harlan thought there was a better answer. The idea had come to him in the winter of 2019 during a site visit to a compressor station north of High Level. He'd been watching a maintenance crew replace a valve housing that had failed ahead of schedule, the third one at that station in 18 months, and he'd found himself staring at the weld seam and thinking about the way thermal stress distributed through it. And something had shifted in his understanding of the problem. Not a solution, not yet, just a different way of seeing the geometry. A sense that the failure wasn't happening where everyone assumed it was happening, that the stress concentrations were originating somewhere upstream in the structure, and the weld seam was just where they finally manifested. He'd started writing things down that night in a notebook he bought at a gas station in High Level. That notebook was the first of the 19 in the cardboard box. What he had eventually worked out through 2 years of weekend hours and borrowed bay time and a great deal of trial and error was a revised geometry for the housing body itself, a shape that distributed thermal stress more evenly across the entire structure rather than concentrating it at the weld interface. The titanium-grade sheeting he'd requisitioned wasn't for the housing itself, it was for a series of precision-formed internal baffles that altered the pressure dynamics inside the housing in a way that complemented the geometric changes. Together, the two modifications produced a housing that his calculations suggested would last 3 to 4 times longer than the current standard under identical operating conditions. He hadn't been able to prove it yet. That was what the 60% complete prototype on the workbench at Northgate had been for. Now that prototype sat in a storage bay at Northgate Fabrications, technically owned by a company that had fired him, and Harlan had 19 notebooks and no workshop and a solution he couldn't demonstrate to anyone. He thought about this problem with the same methodical patience he brought to engineering problems. He made a list of what he had. He made a list of what he needed. He looked at the gap between the two lists and thought about how to close it. His brother-in-law, a man named Stuart Cody, who ran a small custom fabrication shop in Airdrie and had never once in 20 years asked Harlan for anything, answered the phone on the second ring. "Tell me what you need," Stuart said, after Harlan had been talking for about 4 minutes. "Baytime," Harlan said. "Evenings and weekends. 6 months, maybe 8. You got it. I'll pay for materials myself. I'll work around your schedule, Harlan. What just come in Monday?" The next 14 months were the strangest of Harlan Mercer's professional life, and he'd had some strange ones. He was unemployed for the first 6 of them, drawing on savings he'd spent decades accumulating, and trying not to think too directly about the rate at which they were diminishing. He filed a formal request with Northgate to have the prototype returned to him, arguing that the intellectual property embodied in the design was his, that the company had no active project or application for it, and that the materials cost of the sheeting used was more than offset by his uncompensated labor over 22 months of weekends. The request was denied. He filed again through a lawyer, a methodical woman in Calgary named Adele Forsyth, who told him he had a reasonable argument but uncertain odds and who charged him a flat fee he winced at and paid without complaint. The second request was also denied. He started over from scratch. In Stuart's shop in Airdrie, working on Tuesday and Thursday evenings and most of Saturday, Harlan rebuilt the prototype. He bought his own materials this time: the titanium-grade sheeting, the alloy stock for the housing body, the precision fasteners, and he fabricated each component himself on Stuart's equipment. Stuart sometimes came in and watched him work, not saying much, handing him tools when he needed them, making coffee around 9 in the evening when they were both getting tired. They'd grown up in the same neighborhood in Red Deer, gone to the same high school, played hockey together for 3 years on a team that won nothing notable. They had the easy companionship of people who had been young together and understood each other without needing to perform it. "You still think this works?" Stewart asked one evening in March, watching Harlan fit the internal baffle assembly into the housing body. "I know it works," Harlan said. "How do you know?" Harlan set down the fitting tool and looked at the housing for a moment. "Same way you know when a weld's good before you test it. You've seen enough bad ones that you can feel the difference." He picked the tool back up. "I've looked at this geometry from every angle I can think of for 2 years. The physics are right, the distribution model holds up. I just need to prove it to people who need things proven." Stewart nodded and went back to his coffee. During the days when he wasn't in the shop, Harlan kept himself busy in ways that turned out to matter more than he'd expected. He had time, for the first time in years, to spend weekday mornings with his grandson Owen. He'd pick the boy up 2 or 3 mornings a week from Page's place and take him to the park, or to the library for the story program, or just back to the house in Cochrane where Owen would play with the collection of toy construction equipment he kept at Bumpa's place, and Harlan would sit at the kitchen table nearby, working through calculations in a notebook and occasionally being interrupted by a 5-year-old, demanding that he look at an exceptionally important excavator maneuver. He looked, every time. His daughter Paige was 31, a project coordinator for a civil engineering firm in Calgary, and she had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness in roughly equal measure. She worried about him in a way she tried to make look like she wasn't worrying about him. She asked questions about the job search. There were interviews, sporadic, in the early months, in a tone she kept carefully neutral. She didn't ask about the work in Stewart's shop because Harlan had asked her not to ask, and she respected that the way she respected most of his decisions, which was to say she respected it while visibly finding it difficult. "You seem okay," she said to him one evening in May, standing in his kitchen while he made dinner and Owen sat in the living room watching something about animated trains. "I am okay," Harlan said. "You're burning through your savings. The Beaumont Group posted a senior process engineer role last week." "I know," I applied. Paige was quiet for a moment. "And they want someone with recent ERP implementation experience. I don't have that." She leaned against the counter. "Dad, Paige, how much longer?" He thought about the baffle assembly, about the calculations he'd run the previous Tuesday that had come out cleaner than any previous iteration, about the geometry of the housing body and the way the stress would distribute through it at -30 degrees. He thought about 14 months of weekend hockey with Stewart when they were 17, how Stewart always seemed to know where the puck was going to be before it got there, how Harlan had asked him about it once and Stewart had said he couldn't really explain it. He just watched the patterns. "Not much longer," Harlan said. He finished the prototype in September. It took him 3 days to allow himself to believe that what he was looking at was what he thought it was. He went over every weld, every fit, every tolerance dimension. He ran the calculations again twice using 2 different modeling approaches. He had Stewart look at it, though Stewart's expertise was fabrication rather than thermal engineering, and Stewart's assessment was simply that it was the cleanest piece of work he'd seen come out of his shop in 15 years, which wasn't the same kind of validation but was something. Then he contacted a testing facility. The Northern Pipeline Standards Consortium maintained a materials testing center outside Edmonton, one of only a few facilities in Western Canada capable of running sustained thermal cycling tests on pipeline components at the required scale and temperature range. Harlan had worked with the center before, years earlier, on a certification project for a previous employer. He called the facility director, a man named Beaufort Crane who remembered him and who was professionally cautious in the way of people who have seen a great many things claimed about a great many components and have learned not to form opinions before the data arrives. "What are you testing?" Beaufort asked. "A valve housing I designed," Harlan said, "a modified geometry and internal baffling. I'm claiming significantly improved performance under thermal cycling stress in the -25 to -40 range." "How significantly improved?" 3 times the rated lifespan of the current standard housing at equivalent operating pressures. "Possibly more." There was a pause on the line. "That's a significant claim, I know it is. We have capacity in November," Beaufort said. "The full thermal cycling protocol runs 12 weeks minimum. You understand that?" "I understand. And if the results don't support your claims? Then I'll have spent a lot of time and money being wrong," Harlan said, "and I'll need to figure out what I missed." Beaufort made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "I appreciate the honesty. Send me the specifications." The 12 weeks of testing were the longest of Harlan's life, and that was saying something for a man who had spent a considerable portion of his 50s watching his savings account trend in one direction. He continued looking for work during that period, continued going to Stewart's shop on evenings when there was nothing to fabricate, and just sat with the knowledge that the thing he'd made was somewhere in a testing chamber outside Edmonton being subjected to conditions that would either prove him right or prove him wrong. He took Owen to a hockey game in Calgary in December. The boy was 6 now and had opinions about the Flames that were strongly held and loosely reasoned in the way of 6-year-olds' opinions about most things. Harlan bought him a foam finger and a hot chocolate and watched his grandson's face during the first period, which was more satisfying than watching the game. "Bumpa," Owen said at one point without looking away from the ice. "Do you think the goalie is scared?" "I think the goalie is very well trained," Harlan said. Owen considered this. "But do you think he's scared anyway?" "Probably a little," Harlan said. "Most people are scared a little, even when they're very well trained." Owen nodded, apparently satisfied with this, and returned his full attention to the game. Harlan thought about that conversation more than once in the weeks that followed. Beaufort Crane called on a Tuesday morning in late February. Harlan was at his kitchen table with a coffee and a notebook, working through a rough design sketch for a secondary application he'd been thinking about, the same thermal distribution principle applied to a different component type, when his phone rang and he saw the Edmonton area code and set down his pencil. "Mr. Mercer," Beaufort said. "Beaufort, I have your results." The testing center director was a careful man, professionally thorough, not given to dramatizing things he didn't need to dramatize. He walked Harlan through the results methodically, section by section, the way a good engineer reports data without editorializing. The housing had completed the full 12-week protocol. It had been subjected to 840 thermal cycles across the -25 to -42 range. The weld seam inspection had found no propagated fractures at any inspection interval. The pressure variance testing had found no degradation in sealing performance throughout the entire protocol. "The comparison data against the standard housing type is in the appendix," Beaufort said. "At cycle 800, the standard housing shows the fracture propagation pattern we typically see at that point. Your housing shows nothing comparable. What's the projected lifespan differential?" Harlan asked. His voice was steady. He was faintly surprised by how steady it was. "Based on the degradation curves, we're projecting your housing performs to a minimum of 3.4 times the standard lifespan under equivalent conditions, possibly higher. The upper range of the confidence interval puts it closer to 4 times. We'd need extended testing to narrow that." Beaufort paused. "Mr. Mercer, I've been running materials testing for 26 years. I want you to know that what you've submitted here is not a marginal improvement. This is a significant result." Harlan looked out his kitchen window at the February light on the snow in his backyard. "Thank you, Beaufort," he said. He sat with the phone in his hand for a while after the call ended. Then he picked it up again and called Paige. She answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the slight edge of someone who takes calls in the middle of a workday and is accustomed to those calls containing things that require her to rearrange her afternoon. "Dad, what's up?" "The test results came in," Harlan said. A pause. "And 3.4 times the standard lifespan. Possibly 4. The silence that followed was long enough that he thought for a moment the call might have dropped. Then he heard her exhale, a sound he recognized as the control of tension she'd been holding for a long time, the kind of exhale that tries to look casual and doesn't quite manage it. "Dad," she said. "Yeah, that's..." She stopped. Started again. "That's real, isn't it? That's an actual result. It's an actual result." Another silence. "What are you going to do?" "File the patent application today," he said. "Then I'm going to make some calls." The calls took 3 weeks. Harlan was systematic about it, the way he was systematic about everything. He had a list of 22 companies, pipeline operators, infrastructure contractors, fabrication suppliers, and he worked through the list in order of how he assessed their likelihood of interest versus their ability to move quickly. He sent the testing data ahead of each conversation. He let the numbers speak first. Most of the conversation started cautiously and shifted tone somewhere around the 5-minute mark, which was usually when whoever he was speaking with had absorbed enough of what the data actually said to stop treating it as just another cold approach from an independent inventor. The call that mattered most came from a company called Rennick Infrastructure, a mid-sized pipeline contractor based in Edmonton, with operations across northern Alberta and into the Northwest Territories. The vice president of operations was a man named Claude Beaumont, no relation to the civil engineering firm where Paige worked, who had spent the first part of his career as a field engineer in the Northern Corridor, and who understood the thermal cycling problem the way people understand problems they have personally, knelt in the cold to deal with. Claude Beaumont had Harlan drive to Edmonton. They sat across a conference table for 2 hours, going through the testing data page by page, and Claude asked questions that were specific and technically informed and occasionally caught Harlan pleasantly off guard in their precision. This was not a man who needed the engineering explained to him. He understood it. He was checking whether Harlan understood it and whether the data was as clean as it appeared to be. At the end of 2 hours, Claude sat back in his chair. "How many units can you produce?" he asked. "I'm a one-man operation at the moment," Harlan said. "I can produce prototypes and proof-of-concept units. For volume production, I'd need a manufacturing partner. Would you be open to a licensing arrangement?" "I'm open to the right arrangement." Claude nodded. "We have 4 compressor stations in the northern corridor scheduled for valve housing replacement in the next 18 months. I'd like to run your housing as a head-to-head comparison at one of those stations, standard installation, monitored for 12 months. "I'd like that too," Harlan said. "If the field performance matches the lab data," Claude said, "we'll be talking about something considerably larger." The licensing agreement with Rennick Infrastructure was signed in May. It wasn't the largest deal Harlan could have made. There were larger companies that had expressed interest, and one conversation with a national operator that had implied numbers that made Harlan briefly feel like he was in the wrong room. But Rennick was serious and technically sophisticated, and Claude Beaumont was the kind of man who shook your hand at the start of a meeting and again at the end and meant the same thing both times. Stuart Cody threw a party in the Airdrie shop the Friday after the signing. It was mostly neighbors and people from the local fabrication community and Paige and Owen who ate too much of the cake that Stuart's wife Linda had made and was eventually found asleep in the cab of one of Stuart's trucks at 9:30 in the evening, which was where he remained peacefully until his mother came to collect him. Harlan stood at one end of the shop with a beer he'd been nursing for an hour and a half, looking at the space where he'd spent 14 months of evenings and weekends, at the workbench where the prototype had taken shape, at the machinery that had made it possible. He was thinking about Patricia Voss, not with anger exactly. That wasn't quite the word for what he felt when he thought about her. He understood why she'd done what she'd done. He'd understood it at the time, sitting across her desk with her hands flat on either side of the closed folder. She was running a manufacturing operation, she had quarterly numbers to hit, and she had a senior engineer using company resources on an undocumented project that had no timeline and no visible output. From the information she had, the decision she'd made was defensible. It was even reasonable. What she hadn't had was the 19 notebooks, the 2 years of weekends. The understanding accumulated slowly through hundreds of hours of wrong turns, of why the standard housing failed and what the geometry of its failure actually looked like and what a different geometry might do. You couldn't put that in a materials requisition form. You couldn't summarize it in a presentation slot. You could only build it. He'd thought sometimes, in the long months in Stuart's shop, about what he would have said if Patricia had asked him a different question. Not when would it be ready, not what was the measurable output, but something like, what are you actually doing, and why do you think it matters? If she'd asked that, he might have been able to make her understand. He'd never know now, because she hadn't asked it, and he hadn't offered it, and neither of them had bridged the gap that existed between the language she worked in and the language he worked in. He didn't blame her for that gap. It was a common gap. He just lived on the other side of it. Paige found him standing there and came to stand beside him, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, looking out at the party the way they sometimes stood together at the edge of things, both of them more comfortable observing than performing. "You okay?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "You look like you're thinking hard about something." "I'm thinking about language," he said. She looked at him sideways. "That's not what I expected you to say." "What did you expect?" "Something about geometry," she smiled. "Or baffles." He laughed, and it was a real laugh, the kind that loosened something in his chest he hadn't fully realized was still tight. "I'm proud of you," Paige said. Not loudly, not with any ceremony, just said it. "I know," Harlan said. "I know you are." From inside the truck at the back of the shop, still miraculously asleep despite the noise of the party, Owen shifted in his seat and resettled without waking, one hand still loosely wrapped around the plastic fork from his piece of cake. Harlan could see him through the truck's windshield from where he stood. He thought about what Owen had asked at the hockey game, about whether the goalie was scared even when he was well trained, and about what he'd said in response. He still thought the answer was right. Most people were scared a little, even when they knew what they were doing, even when they'd done the work and had the notebooks to show for it, and had sat in the testing facility waiting for the data and believed, as deeply as he knew how to believe anything, that the numbers were going to come out clean. You were still scared a little. That was just what it was to be the person trying to prove something that hadn't been proven yet. He took a slow drink of his beer. He'd been right about the housing. He'd been right about the geometry and the stress distribution and the baffles and all 19 notebooks worth of calculations and dead ends and corrections. He'd been right in the way that only became visible after the fact, after the 12 weeks in the testing chamber, and the calls, and the drive to Edmonton and the 2 hours with Claude Beaumont going through the data page by page. He'd been right the whole time. Even when he was sitting in the chair across from Patricia Voss's desk with his signature on a materials requisition form and no measurable output to show for 22 months. He'd been right then too. He just hadn't been able to prove it yet.